kiddos. How are you guys? Well, you can't answer me. I hope you guys are good. Ms. Crowe and I are here today to go over some of the work we gave you before spring break. We just miss you so much and we miss teaching so much that we couldn't help ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up some notes that we're going to share to you guys so that you guys can see these notes that we took on the videos we assigned you right before spring break got out. Here we go. Okay, we are good. We're in screen sharing mode. Ms. Crowe, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Fantastic. So you guys, if you haven't already, we have these videos posted for you on Ms. Crowe's wonderful government class website. It's up here. If you haven't watched these videos, go watch them before you listen to us go over the notes, because you won't know what we're talking about if you don't watch them first. Cool? Cool. Without further ado, presidential powers, crash course number 1. So there were a lot of things we learned in this video. As you guys might have guessed, we're going to start talking about the presidency now. The first thing we have to know about the president is that he has 2 types of powers. He gets formal powers that are directly from the Constitution and informal ones that come from Congress or the office of the president himself. Now, the ones that come from the Constitution all come from Article 2. Remember, Congress was Article 1, the judicial branch was Article 3, and now we're talking about Article 2, which is the presidency. In the video, it talked about viewing these presidential powers from a conservative point of view ideologically and a liberal point of view ideologically. So remember, conservatives, they don't like change, right? So when you talk about the presidency from a conservative ideology, you're talking about the idea of strict constructionism, which means sticking right to the Constitution. Exactly what the Constitution says is all that goes. But when you talk about it from a liberal ideology, remember, liberals like change, we're a little more flexible. We're allowing for loose constructionism, which means allowing for the role of the president to change over time. We also have some qualifications to be president. Unfortunately, this one is not like the Supreme Court where we said even young boy could be a Supreme Court justice. Instead, for it to be president, you have to be 35 years old, a natural born citizen, which means born in the US, and a 14-year resident. Finally, the president is not directly elected by the people. He's chosen by the Electoral College, but we're going to tell you about that later. So just know that word. We'll tell you more later. Yeah.
Once again, that word is electoral, not electoral. Common mistake, don't do it. But moving on to roles and powers of the president. You heard in the video some talk about powers that the president has. Let's go over them real quick. President obviously has military powers, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This is a formal power. It's found in the Constitution. President also has the power to appoint. It can be cabinet members, federal judges, Supreme Court justices that we just talked about. But they all need the approval of the Senate. And that, again, is a formal power. The president acts as chief host or chief diplomat. This means that he receives ambassadors and dignitaries from foreign countries. And this is more powerful of a power than it sounds. This means the president is first to be in contact with these people, has huge impact on foreign relations, foreign policy. This is an informal power. President acts as chief legislator, can propose laws, he can make suggestions. If you remember our good friend Bill, he can veto legislation. This is largely an informal power as well. Going back into the Constitution, the president has to give the State of the Union address. This can help set policy agenda for the year, help the president as chief legislator. And again, in the Constitution, he's got to do it. The president has judicial powers, can grant pardons and reprieves. These are things directly mentioned in the Constitution. Now, a pardon is to kind of get rid of that criminal process, get rid of that punishment, kind of wipe it away, whereas a reprieve is a delay of punishment. If we're talking about all roles of the president, there are 7 of them. The first, chief executive, chief legislator, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief. Kind of talked about these already a little bit. Getting to those last 3, though, the president acts as head of state, kind of goes hand in hand with being chief diplomat. The president takes on ceremonial roles, including welcoming ambassadors. This means that the president is largely the face of our country. people overseas think about the United States, one of the pictures that pops up immediately for them is the president. The president acts as economic planner. He's responsible for the creation of a budget proposal that is presented to Congress. Congress doesn't have to accept this proposal, but they have to hear out the president. And then finally, the president acts as party leader. He won the election. He's a member of a political party. He automatically becomes the head of that party.
Now, because we know that you guys were so invested in video 1 that you just went straight to video 2, you binge watched that crash course, we're going to go ahead and just go straight into the notes for video 2. So more on presidential powers. You ready? We're going to really break down the difference between the formal and the informal powers on this one. So this video talks about powers that are not explicitly or directly given in the Constitution. That's our informal powers. So the first informal power is related to the president being the commander-in-chief, right? So we said that being commander-in-chief means that the president gets to tell the military what to do. Now, Congress usually has to have the power to declare war, right? That's a check on the president's power. But an informal power that the president has is that he can mobilize troops without Congress having declared war yet. So the president can send troops wherever he believes they need to go if there's immediate danger. And then there are 60 days before Congress has to okay that decision. So that's an informal power he has as commander-in-chief. The next informal power he has is as chief diplomat. So we said that as chief diplomat, something the president does is make treaties, right, with other nations. Now, the president can also make something called an executive agreement with the leaders of other nations. This is like a treaty, but it's easier to pass. A treaty has to be passed by 2/3 approval of the Senate. An executive agreement, on the other hand, only needs the majority of the House and Senate to be valid, so to go into action and to actually work. So it's easier to pass than a treaty. That's another informal power. An example of this is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Highly recommend you look that up if you haven't. Next is our informal powers that's related to being a chief executive. So we said as chief executive, the president is trying to run the country, right? He's trying to enact laws and show how they're going to be implemented. He gets to appoint judges. Remember how we said in the Supreme Court, the justices are appointed first by the president and then approved by the Senate, ambassadors and other ministers and cabinet heads, right? So because he gets to appoint these people, the president is putting the people who are showing how the laws are going to work in charge, right? So the agency heads implement the laws as the president wants them to. So this is a really big power the president has. And then he has a few powers about being chief legislator.
One of those powers is the legislative initiative. This is where the president drafts legislation. He proposes that legislation. He kind of steers legislative policy in the direction that he would like it to go. This doesn't always work out. It's more effective when the president is more popular. So for example, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, executive orders. These are rules with the force of law. They're attached to a law. They were never passed by Congress. So we can't call them a law. We have to call them executive orders. These can be overturned by an actual law, a Supreme Court decision, or another executive order. In fact, most executive orders are kind of overturned by other executive orders from a new president. Some executive orders you might be interested in, the one that desegregates the military, and the one from Korematsu versus the US that segregated people of enemy ancestry from the general US population. The president can impound funds if he doesn't like how Congress is spending money. Now, this is exactly what you think of when you think of impounding a car. The president's going to take that money and then hold on to it until Congress comes up with a better idea. And finally, executive privilege. This is the ability to keep information secret for national security's sake. It can be overturned order more than anything else, as we saw in US versus Nixon, which is your next Supreme Court case, which you should already be annotating. Once presidents have established a new implied power, they're very, very rarely revoked. For example, back in 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. The Constitution didn't tell him he could, but it also didn't tell him he couldn't either. And since then, several other presidents have purchased land for the US from other countries.
Exactly. So there are lots of different ways that the president can use all of these informal powers. Have we gotten to post-video questions yet? Sorry, I had to run out. My roommate is having trouble with the machine.
Nope. We're ready for those video questions now, though.
Beautiful. All right, I had great timing. Sorry, guys. So questions to answer post-video. These were the questions that we posted on Ms. Crow's website. If you guys want to share your questions with us, you can always put them in the comments, and we're happy to look over them. Or if you want to share your answers with us, and we can tell you kind of like how you did, you're welcome to do that as well. But we figured that we would go over these so that you guys could see kind of what was going on in our heads as if we were grading these, right? So that you guys understand what we're looking for when we say these. So we'll start.
And your answers don't need to match ours. We're just giving you examples.
Yeah, these are just so you guys know what it's like, or like what we want you guys to take away from these two videos. So the first one is to differentiate legislative, executive, judicial, and diplomatic powers, providing an example of each. So differentiate just means show the difference of them and provide an example. So if I were to do the legislative power of the president, I would talk about how his power as legislator in chief is mostly a directive power. It's mostly his ability to be able to steer the way that legislation goes. An example of that is his ability to go ahead and set the agenda for the Congress in the State of the Union. So like Ms. Crowe was saying earlier, the State of the Union is the speech that the president gives once a year. And in that, he gets to ask Congress to lay out certain policy initiatives. That's how I would describe his legislative power.
Thinking about executive powers, I'm really thinking about how president as chief executive has to make sure the law is executed, it's enforced, it applies to the whole country. One of the ways the president does that is through an appointment power. He appoints members of the cabinet, Supreme Court justices even, who all help him make sure the law is enforced and carried out.
After that, we can talk about the judicial powers. So while the president doesn't have a lot of judicial powers, and the judiciary can be a check on the president's power, he does get to give pardons and reprieves. And so I think one of the most important examples of a pardon that's been given, you guys, your next case study is going to be US versus Nixon. Hopefully you've already looked at that. But after this whole case went down, and after Nixon stepped down before he could be impeached, Gerald Ford, who was the president who came after him, decided to pardon Nixon so that the country could return to normalcy. So that would be an example of the president using his judicial powers.
Diplomatic powers goes back to the president as chief diplomat and interacting with other countries. So some examples that I would write down here: executive agreements and treaties themselves.
Very important. So like we said, your examples don't have to be exactly the same as ours, but those were some good ones that you guys could look for. Next, we asked you to compare the formal and the informal powers. So I'll start with formal powers. If I'm thinking formal, I'm thinking something that is very clearly laid out, very explicitly stated. And in this case, in the Constitution, right? We're always going back to the Constitution. It's our favorite document. So the formal powers of the president are laid out explicitly in the Constitution, whereas the informal powers are ones that have been interpreted.
Formal powers, I would continue on by saying, kind of deal with the structure and setup of government, how it works, what it's supposed to look like. Whereas the informal powers rest more with the personal exercise of the president, what he could do versus what he has to do as directed by the Constitution.
It's like how you guys could spend that extra week editing your paper and get an A+, but you have to edit it at least once. Next, explain how the presidency represents the idea of limited government. So this one, we have to go back to the idea of checks and balances. Remember how we say that the branches of government are always trying to check each other? They're always trying to halt each other or limit each other so that no one person gets too much power. This is very real in the idea of the presidency. The way the presidency is limited, if you look through all of these rules and roles that we've laid out, right? A lot of them, the president has to have the approval of Congress, or he can be stopped by the judiciary if he does something wrong, right? The courts can tell him he has to stop what he's doing. So the idea of limited government is expressed here by making sure that the president doesn't get too much power all for himself or herself in the future.
If we go back to limited government, when we talked about British government, this is the idea that government is not and should not be all powerful. The word president comes from the word preside, meaning to watch over. This word was chosen by the writers of the Constitution very carefully. He's there to kind of steer the government in its general direction. He's not there to rule with an iron fist. He's even more limiting, has to be chosen indirectly by the people themselves.
And after that, we asked you to explain how the presidential powers have changed over time. So this is something that you guys, they talked about a little bit in the video, but you guys can also understand having seen how the amendments work and having looked at the history of the US, right? Over time, I would say probably the biggest change I see is that the presidential powers, the informal ones specifically, have expanded. There are more and more of them as the times change and as roles of the president there are more demands put on the president for what he needs to do.
We also see two roles of the president develop over time: economic planner and party leader. Parties haven't been around through all of US history. And so that's something that's grown as the presidency, as the US government has grown as well. As his economic planner, the president is expected to present a budget proposal to Congress. Is it directly in the Constitution? No, but it's something Congress expects from him as chief legislator.
And then finally, we define executive agreements, executive orders, and executive privilege. Now, they all start with the word executive, but they're really different things. So an executive agreement, when you think about that, you want to think he's agreeing to something with other countries, right? That's the one where he gets to circumvent treaties and he can make agreements with other countries and have a simple majority pass it, so it's easier to pass. The next is executive orders. Executive orders are a rule that has the force of law, but certain things can happen to them. What are those, Ms. Crowe?
When executive order is a rule of law, it is attached to a law, but it's never actually passed by Congress.
And then finally, we have executive privilege. And that's when the president wants to keep information secret for national security purposes. While this can be overturned by a court order, this is like if you hear like privileged information, if you've ever heard that before, that means that it's privileged. Only certain people can hear it for security purposes. And then your final question was to explain in your favorite type of paragraph, an ACES paragraph, which power you believe is the most important. So that means you would answer that question, cite evidence for it from what you've seen in the videos or in your reading, explain the ideas that you have, summarize and synthesize your opinion, and tell us which one you believe is most important. You're welcome to paste these paragraphs or write them if you haven't yet and put them in the comments below. We would love to read them and see what you guys are thinking based on the videos that you've watched and on our lecture. So there's only one last thing I want to add for you guys, and that is just that Ms. Crowe and I are here to support you, answer your questions, let you know what's going on, if at all possible. I know this is a weird situation, but we're going to keep coming out with these videos so that you guys can keep learning about government, because that's what's supposed to be happening right now. Anything you want to add, Ms. Crowe, before we sign off?
We'll be back with annotations for US versus Nixon, a reading packet, and obviously other things because we can't leave you alone. That would be too nice.
I agree. Get excited, folks.